I'm beginning here with this pretty famous image that I'm sure virtually everybody in the room has seen. John Dominus took this in 1968 at the Mexico City Olympics. It shows Tommy Smith and John Carlos standing atop the medal podium after they were awarded gold and bronze medals respectively, and the national anthem is currently playing. They've lowered their heads, and each has raised a black gloved fist in the air. And this silent performance, if you want, this silent demonstration that took place in October of 1968 obviously reverberated across the world, but certainly had a powerful impact in the United States. In 1968, when this happened, I wasn't aware of it. I was just a young child. But I saw this photograph reproduced in a 1970 edition, I think it was Time or Life, of the decade, the best in pictures. And I showed it to my mom because I knew, to me, this picture was different from everything else I had seen in the book. And I said, what's going on here? And I can't remember her explanation in any great detail, but I remember that she said that these were men who were making the Olympics political. And that stuck in my mind, that they were being political. And I wasn't sure how, and I wasn't sure why, and I didn't know whether it was good or bad, though the tone in which my mom told it to me made it clear that this political wasn't a particularly good thing. But it stuck in my mind that this was political. And this kind of interest in this image and in what we might call the famous civil rights photographs of the 1960s was only heightened by the fact that I was taught by a generation of professors who really came of age in the 1960s, who saw this as this seminal moment in American history, and often sort of chastised my generation for not having the kind of political engagement that they had. This was this mythical era when everything was possible, and yet I was also aware of the fact that everything didn't quite come true, that we were living in the legacy of the 1960s, but somehow all that promise hadn't been realized. So in a lot of ways, for a long time, it was Reuben. See, it does work. In a lot of ways, the photos, the images from that era that have most interested me are the ones that I refer to as the most iconic. They're the ones that virtually any American over the age of 50 and many younger can instantly conjure up in their minds. They're the photos of the attack dogs that were used in Birmingham in May of '63. They're the troopers with gas masks beating marchers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. And they're famously John Lewis in his tan trench coat as he's being clubbed to the ground. These images sort of are burned into virtually every American's mind, and if you read the literature on these images, they're credited with having an incredible power over America, specifically a power over white America. The literature talks about the fact that when these images were first shown, they provided liberals in the North a kind of wake-up call that allowed them to distance themselves from conservative whites in the South. It's also suggested that these images were powerfully important in giving President Kennedy and later Johnson the kind of political cover to enact long-stalled civil rights legislation. These images, much like some of the kind of catastrophic moments that Joan was talking about yesterday, are credited at least with really changing American society and ushering us into a new era. And in the study that Linda so kindly read, what I was interested in doing is not debating, well, the degree to which they did or did not change America, but I was really interested in how they enacted their work on white people, because the argument is always made that this changed how white people looked at the world. So as in contrast to the traditional ways in which these images are understood, I wasn't interested in looking at them to see what were the black strategies that were enacted on the streets, and I wasn't interested in saying, well, did it or did it not change America? But what I was interested in, why did white Americans talk about these things as so moving? And what was the means by which they made white Americans very emotional? And I would sort of get to the degree to which they changed or didn't change American society later. Now, to give you a kind of little case study today, I'm going to focus specifically on those dog attack pictures and on the water hoses that were used against demonstrators in Birmingham in 1963. And I'll give you just a tiny bit of context, because I find that in speaking to audiences, often people get a little hazy on the details. I'm showing you just a kind of image to emblematize Birmingham prior to '63. You can see, colored only here. Birmingham was kind of selected as a target city by Dr. King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the winter of 1963. He brought together a whole coalition of leaders, and they decided they were going to stage a protest in Birmingham. Some of the discussions that revolved around what they were going to do in Birmingham had everything to do with what was considered to be their failure in Albany from the preceding year, where more than a year of anti-segregationist protests had led to no compromises on the part of the white establishment. A lot of the reason that Albany was seen as a failure is because the police chief there, a man by the name of Laurie Pritchard, styled itself as a kind of moderate practitioner of nonviolent policing. Pritchard had read King's report on the Montgomery bus boycott, and he basically tried to counter all of King's strategies before he implemented them in Albany. He knew that one of King's goals was going to be to fill the jails, to overwhelm the police with as many protesters as was possible, to fill the jails, and then the police wouldn't be able to arrest any more people and they'd be forced to negotiate. So Pritchard, being very sly, made rental agreements with police departments in outlying areas to make it virtually impossible, no matter how many thousands of eager recruits King could generate in Albany, to ever be possible to fill the jails. And Pritchard also knew that it was acts of police violence in public that would galvanize the interests of whites in the North. So he determined not to have any violent scenes play out in public. The argument's been made that Pritchard was as violent as any other Southern sheriff or law enforcement officer in the South, but that he knew that these things couldn't happen in public. And he specifically, Pritchard, talked about the fact that he was practicing nonviolent law enforcement. It would be a counter to the nonviolent direct action that King was going to practice. Now, Birmingham seemed like a more appealing target city for King because Birmingham was, if anything, even more segregated than Albany. Birmingham was famous for its particularly violent strain of law enforcement and of the local population. A lot of people in the movement referred to Birmingham as Bommingham because there had been more than 24 unsolved bombings since World War II that were directed against black civic and religious leaders and civil rights organizers. None of them had ever been solved. But Birmingham was probably most appealing because of this man, Eugene Bull Connor, who had a reputation as one of the most confrontational law enforcement officers in the South. Unlike Pritchard, Connor prized himself on reacting violently to civil rights demonstrators. And King was well aware of the fact that he did not have the ability to reach sympathetic liberal whites in the North, which was ultimately his target audience, unless he had spectacular scenes of violence. He was counting on Connor to produce those scenes, knowing that Connor loved the press, that he had a short fuse, that he was willing to give incredible news conferences where he said exactly what was on his mind. King was aware of the fact that blacks in Birmingham didn't wield sufficient power to be able to change the systems on their own. What they needed was an influx of sympathy, of power, of monetary support that would ultimately come from northern whites that King appreciated could be turned into natural allies if the right circumstance was produced.